Good morning. Did you come to services this morning to feast upon the Word of God? I hope so. Okay. I hope so. There will be no ear tickling today. Just a warning. I want to start off this morning. Am I loud? I feel like I'm really loud. I want to start off this morning by going through two songs. I'll read to you the lyrics of one, and then I'm going to sing very briefly another one, and I ask that you don't make fun of me or anything like that. I do think it will make the point well. The first song I will not sing. It is a song that came out in 1971, is still famous today, and it was written by John Lennon, called Imagine. You guys have heard this song? Okay. It's very famous, and let's just read a couple of the lyrics. He says, "Imagine there's no heaven. It's easy if you try. No hell below us, above us only sky. Imagine all the people living for today." Then he says, "Imagine there's no countries. It isn't hard to do. Nothing to kill or die for, and no religion, too. Imagine all the people living life in peace. You may say I'm a dreamer, but I'm not the only one. I hope someday you'll join us and the world will be as one." And he goes on from there. It's a famous hippie song, we might call it, but it also reads very much like a manifesto, so to speak, of a Marxist and atheistic ideology. And it's an ideology that still exists today. And I think fundamentally it is this belief that, number one, humanity is good in and of itself, but certain things make us do evil things. Certain things like possessions or countries, and especially religion. And the idea is that if we're going to move past this kind of primal age that we're living in into a great society of peace and prosperity, if we're going to move on into what they call the utopia, then we have to unshackle ourselves from these things. We have to stop believing in God, and if we were to do that, then life would be great. Society would be peaceful. Everyone would love each other. That's the viewpoint. And again, this philosophy, I think John Lennon's words state it very well in a nutshell, what it is that he and many believe. Many atheists believe, not all of them, but many of them believe that the world would be a better place if people just stopped believing in God. So that's the first song. The second song we're going to look at is very different, and I apologize for not having the words on the screen, but I'm going to go ahead and just sing a verse. Maybe you've heard it before. It's a VBS song, okay? So if you know it, go ahead and sing with me. But I have a feeling that many of you haven't heard it before. All right, here we go. The Lord told Noah there's going to be a floody, floody. Lord told Noah there's going to be a floody, floody. Get those children out of the muddy, muddy, children of the Lord. Okay, a lot more of you know it than I thought. I don't know why I thought you didn't know it. All right, let's sing one more verse. The Lord told Noah to build him an arky, arky. Lord told Noah to build him an arky, arky. Build it out of gopher, barky, barky, children of the Lord. Very good job. A+, gold star. Is that a song you learned in your childhood? Okay. It's a song I learned in my childhood as well. It's interesting that we can have a really fun kids song about a moment in our history when everyone on earth perished in a judgmental flood, except for 8 people. You ever think about that? You ever think about the fact that we have pictures like this on the screen behind me where we make the story very kid-friendly, and we like to sing about it. And you know, this story really fascinates children. It really opens up the imagination. Maybe it's because of the animals, I'm not sure. But we love this story as children, and we love to tell it to children. And when we do that, we oftentimes give a kind of cartoony version where we leave out some of the darker details. Because it's very intriguing to me that such a dark story is also a story we all learned when we were really, really young. And it's a story that everyone knows. And so those are the two songs, and they're very different, as you notice. We have the song Imagine by John Lennon, which proposes this atheistic philosophy. And then we have this song about Noah's Ark. Very different. Hopefully you'll see by the end of this lesson how they are connected, at least in this lesson. But let's go ahead and look at the story of Noah's Ark, the story of the flood. I warn you right now, we're not going to be able to go over every detail. We're talking about 3 chapters. Most of what we talk about this morning will be from Genesis chapter 6, just the opening verses. But I do want us to take a look at this very well-known story. As we come back into the Story of Redemption series, I want us to take a look at this very well-known story and, if need be, recalibrate how we view it. Kind of absolve ourselves of the kid-friendly version and really observe this story for the darkness, the dark lessons that it teaches us about humanity and about what we deserve. Because when you really look at this story, the first thing you realize is that it is a story about man's evil. We as human beings are evil. We are corrupt. To give you quick context, we remember in Genesis chapter 1 and 2, we see the creation account. God creates mankind as the pinnacle of creation. He creates us to rule over everything else and to be image bearers for him. And then in chapter 3, of course, we read about Adam and Eve falling from grace. We see them turn against God, and things from that point snowball and go from bad to worse. Not only are they punished, they're cast out of the garden and they're going to die, and there's pain in childbearing. There's also pain in their work and in farming because thorns and thistles have come up from the ground. There's this real idea that their fall took creation with it. They took creation with them in their fall. And then in chapter 4, we read about their children where Cain murders Abel. We see the first murder of human history. And Cain runs off, and he has descendants, and he builds a society that just becomes evil over generations. It becomes more and more evil, more and more violent. And then we get to Genesis chapter 6, and we find out that things have snowballed so much that everyone on earth. Let's let the verse do the talking for us. It says the Lord, and this is in chapter 6, verse 5, the Lord saw the wickedness of man was great in the earth, and that every intention of the thoughts of his heart was only evil continually. I don't remember that verse in the God Told Noah song. Humanity was evil. I don't remember that part. We leave it out, don't we? When we think of this from the kind of the children's point of view, we don't always talk about this part of it, but it's really the crux of the story. It's the inciting incident. It's the reason for everything that takes place. And we're told a few more details about just how bad things were in verses 11 and 12, where it says, now the earth was corrupt in God's sight, and the earth was filled with violence. So these are the two words, corrupt and violent. He says, and God saw the earth, and behold, it was corrupt, for all flesh had corrupted their way in the earth. Kind of an important word if it's repeated so many times in just those two verses. This word in the Hebrew, it literally means spoiled, like rotten food. You ever left milk in the fridge for too long? You pull it out. You think you're going to pour yourself a nice glass of milk, but instead you pour yourself a nice glass of cottage cheese. That's the word. That's the idea. Humanity has become tarnished. We've gone away from what we were supposed to be, what we were designed to be, image bearers of our Creator. We've tarnished ourselves and become rotten, spoiled refuge, the kind of food you'd find in the trash. That's what the word corrupt here means. And of course, we're given more detail. He says we're violent. Humanity has gone so far away from God, and they've spiraled out of control to the point that they've just become corrupt and violent. Now you know why I read to you the words of John Lennon in the song Imagine. Because that philosophy that he espoused says that, if we turn away from God, if we just get away from God, we'd become less violent, we'd become better people. But reality shows something very different. That when we go against God, the only inevitable conclusion is that we become corrupt and we become violent. And we see this play out in history. Think about the 20th century for a moment. A short 100 years that's the bloodiest in human history when it comes to murder by the state. There are several nations we could look at, and the experiment, this atheistic philosophy that's supposedly going to reach a utopian dream, the experiment on that has already been run, and it's been found wanting. The first nation to do this was, of course, the Soviet Union. And I've talked about some of the horrors that went on in the Soviet Union before. I read a book called The Gulag Archipelago, and I highly recommended it before. I will highly recommend it again. You need to read it. It's a hard read, though, because the horrors that took place in this nation, which was the first nation to make statewide atheism their creed, the first nation to say, okay, we're all atheists, was also one of the bloodiest in all of human history. Under Joseph Stalin, some 60 million people either starved to death or were murdered or worked to death in labor camps, forced slave labor. Now that number, 60 million, that's the low estimate, but it's also a number so high we can hardly even imagine it. But it's certainly not the only place where things like that happened. Another country that this took place, that went through a very similar history in the 20th century is China, under Chairman Mao Zedong. I've talked about Mao before from this pulpit. Maybe I have a thing about dictators. I don't know why I keep preaching about dictators, but I've talked about Mao before. It was a long time ago, at least when it comes to memory of sermons. It was a long time ago. So you probably don't remember me talking about him. But under Chairman Mao, China was going to apparently go into the future, reach this great new utopian vision, and Mao believed the same philosophy that if we just unshackle ourselves from religion, that'll be the key for us to move forward. And so what did they do? They said, okay, we're atheists now, and they got rid of all religion, and some 45 million people were killed. At least that's the estimate. Now, China has since opened up a little bit to religion, but it's still highly regulated, and there's no real freedom to worship as you please. In fact, there are horrors going on right now in China to the Muslim population. There are Chinese Muslims who are being brought into concentration camps as we speak. For some reason, we don't like to talk about it. Maybe some of you haven't even heard about it. But it's a horrible humanitarian crisis that is taking place right now in China. But, of course, we've seen this play out all over the world. We might think of North Korea. We might think of other places. There are some places we probably don't think about, like Cambodia. But Cambodia is a big one because Pol Pot, once again, was going to usher in this great utopia, and he wound up wiping out a fourth of the population of his nation. Think about that. 1 out of every 4 people in Cambodia died, and it was just in like 4 years. What is it about turning away from God that leads us to such violence and corruption? Well, you may say, well, that's not necessarily, like, they had their own problems. It wasn't necessarily because they were atheists. Well, I would push back on that. And I'll give you a couple reasons. First, I want to read you a quote from Alexander Solzhenitsyn, who wrote the Gulag Archipelago. Here's what he said. He witnessed the horrors of the Soviet Union firsthand. And this is what he said. He said, over half a century ago, while I was still a child, I recall hearing a number of old people offer the following explanation for the great disasters that had befallen Russia. Men have forgotten God. That is what has happened. Since then, I have spent well nigh 50 years working on the history of our revolution. In the process, I have read hundreds of books, collected hundreds of personal testimonies, and have already contributed 8 volumes of my own toward the effort of clearing away the rubble left by that upheaval. But if I were asked today to formulate as concisely as possible the main cause for the ruinous revolution that swallowed up on some 60 million of our people, I could not put it more accurately than to repeat, men have forgotten God. That is why all this has happened. What is it about this philosophy that leads inevitably to death and destruction? What is it about turning away from God that makes us so violent and corrupt? Well, I think we actually see the answer to this question, this correlation, here in the flood account in Genesis chapter 9. Of course, this is after the flood has taken place. God says this to Noah, chapter 9, verse 6. Whoever sheds the blood of man, by man shall his blood be shed, for God made man in his own image. You see, when you embody the idea that everyone's made in the image of God, you're going to treat them as if they have value. Every individual has value if they're made in the image of God. But if you don't embody that viewpoint, if you don't believe that every individual is made in the image of God, then you can start to judge their value by arbitrary means, such as how much they contribute to society or what you can get out of them. And so in many of these societies, these atheistic societies, each individual person became a speed bump along the way to utopia. The ends justified the means, because what we were trying to get to was worth more than these individuals who were dying along the way. You see, when you don't view people as image bearers of God, you don't value them the way you ought to. And it leads inevitably to carnage. And we don't need to think for a second that here in the United States we've got it all figured out and we view people differently. It is because so many in our society don't view humans as image bearers of God that has led to the abortion crisis in this nation. So many unborn infants, and I can see some of you shifting in your seats. I know it's uncomfortable. So many unborn infants are viewed as expendable in our society. Why? Because we're not viewing each individual as image bearers of God. Now here's the crazy thought when we get back here to Genesis chapter 6. It seems what's being described here is that this evil, this wickedness, which we can see in history, this wickedness we can kind of point to certain nations. It seems that here in Genesis chapter 6, at this very early moment in our history, it wasn't just limited to one nation or another nation or one group of people hurting another innocent group of people. It seems that every single person, just about every single person, had fallen all this way and had become violent and corrupt. It had gotten so bad that God looks at humanity and regrets having made us. You see, this story is not only a story about man's evil, it's also a story about God's regret. Look at verses 6 and 7. It says, "And the Lord regretted that he made man on the earth. And it grieved him to his heart. So the Lord said, I will blot out man whom I have created from the face of the land, man and animals and creeping things and birds of the heavens, for I am sorry that I have made them." Again, this is a far cry from the picture books, isn't it? A far cry from that song we sang, Humanity had spoiled. We had tarnished. We were no longer bearing the image of God the way we were designed to, and we were murdering each other. We were violent. And notice what it leads to. In this verse, God isn't only planning to wipe out mankind. He's planning to wipe out all of his creation. It includes animals. It includes all of these creeping things along the ground. It includes the birds. God says, mankind has been corrupted so badly that I'm going to wipe everything out, all of creation. Now, why? Why wouldn't God just take out the humans only? You ever thought about that? You ever wonder that? I think a lot of times we kind of neglect this side of the story. But I think there is a very important reason that our corruption would lead to the destruction not only of ourselves, but of all of creation. And that's because we were designed to be the pinnacle of creation. In the Genesis 1 account, as we've seen, the world wasn't very good until we were on it. And it really seems that in God's view of things, creation isn't worth having if humanity isn't at its pinnacle. And, of course, we see this borne out in the fall account. When Adam and Eve sinned, what happened to the earth? It fell too. The thorns and the thistles came up, and I think many of us would agree that hurricanes and tornadoes and all sorts of things came up because of our fall. In other words, we were designed to be the pinnacle of a perfect creation, and then we turned away from God, and we fell, and we took creation with us. And now it's gotten so bad here in Genesis chapter 6 that God looks upon the earth and he says, I'm going to take it all out. Because they've just corrupted it that much. Now you might at this point say, raise your hand maybe tentatively and say, but we're still here. Humanity is still here. Creation is still here. Why is that? And that's, of course, when we get to verse 8, the surprise of the story. Because this is not only a story of man's evil and God's regret for making us, it's also a story about God's grace. Let's go ahead and read verses 8 and 9. It says, but Noah found favor in the eyes of the Lord. These are the generations of Noah. Noah was a righteous man, blameless in his generation. Noah walked with God. Now, I don't want us to misunderstand. While Noah is this great example to us because he stood out, we need to realize that Noah was sinful. Noah wasn't perfect. He had his own problems. We can read about some of them. We also know that this text very clearly states he was blameless in his generation. In other words, he was righteous by comparison. Now that's a very commendable statement. But I don't think we're supposed to read this and think that Noah was so great and so righteous that he saved humanity from destruction. Instead, I believe we're meant to see this story as a story of God's grace toward humanity. And he used Noah to spare us destruction. But not only us, but all of creation. Now we know the story. It's very famous. We know that Noah had to build the ark for decades, that he had to preach to a society that was not listening, society that didn't believe him. And then, of course, when the ark was finally built, the rains started coming, the animals came in 2 by 2, and Noah and his family go into the ark, they close the door, and I can't even begin to imagine what it must have been like. What it must have been like to hear the rain thundering, to feel the lurch as the ark is then picked up by the waters, to hear the screams of all the people outside, until finally, after all this thundering rain, after all the rocking back and forth, eventually silence. And they're left wondering in the pitch black, what next? What's going to happen? In chapter 8, verses 1 and 2, it says, but God remembered Noah and all the animals, all the beasts and the livestock that were with him on the ark. God then made the wind blow over the earth, and the waters subsided. It is by God's grace that he gives humanity a second chance. He makes the water subside. Noah and his family eventually feel the ark land on solid ground, and they open up the doors, and they are greeted to a completely new world. And God then makes a covenant with Noah. But not only a covenant with Noah, and not only a covenant with man. I want us to notice, he makes a covenant with all of creation. Look at what he says in chapter 9, verses 11 through 15. God says to Noah, I establish my covenant with you, that never again shall all flesh be cut off by the waters of the flood, and never again shall there be a flood to destroy the earth. And God said, this is the sign of the covenant that I make between me and you and every living creature that is with you for all future generations. I have set my bow in the cloud, and it shall be a sign of the covenant between me and the earth. When I bring clouds over the earth and the bow is seen in the clouds, I will remember my covenant that is between me and you and every living creature of all flesh, and the waters shall never again become a flood to destroy all flesh. God establishes a covenant with creation, and he says, I will never again wipe it all out. And I want us to understand what he's saying. I want us to understand something here. God isn't saying, oh, I'll never again lose my temper or anything like that. I think that's somehow how people portray God when they're skeptics. God is not saying anything like that. The reason for the flood was not him necessarily, or it all started because of our evil. And so what he's saying is I will not bring about the destruction that you and creation deserve. This is God's grace. The fact that God gives humanity a second chance, the fact that he gives creation a second chance through us and through Noah, is a story of grace. And that's especially proven when we continue just reading a couple chapters later and we see what happens with humanity. And of course, we're going to be looking at that story next week, the story of the Tower of Babel. And we see people are still corrupted. They're still tarnished. They're still doing evil. They're still corrupt. They're still violent. But God has given them this second chance. Through Noah, God spared creation. But if we're still corrupt, what hope do we have? You see, this covenant with the rainbow that God makes with creation, it is an important covenant, but it is a precursor to a better covenant. A covenant where instead of sparing humanity, sparing creation through one imperfect man, God will redeem humanity and creation through the perfect man of Jesus Christ. It is only through Jesus Christ that we have hope. Now, we started off this sermon with a reading from Ephesians chapter 2, which states that we were all once by nature children of wrath. We deserved destruction. But God, being rich in mercy, saved us while we were still sinners. He brought us out of that nature, and he's given us something new. And if you keep reading in those verses, I didn't have Eldon keep reading, but if you read into verses 8 through 10, you find out that he has taken us out of that nature of wrath and brought us into his own workmanship, so that we are created in Christ Jesus for good works, which he set aside beforehand. That's verse 10. Now, this is a concept that could fill up a whole other sermon, so I'm not going to spend much time on it, but I do want us to understand that our redemption through Jesus Christ is a redemption of that tarnish, of that rottenness, that corruption that started all the way back in Genesis chapter 3. Through Jesus Christ, he is already transforming us. But by the end of the story, we will be fully transformed. And not only us, but creation also. creation through us. We will take back that image-bearing pinnacle that we were supposed to have in the first place. Go ahead and read with me from Romans chapter 8. This is the last passage we'll look at, but in Romans chapter 8, starting in verse 19, this is what the Apostle Paul says. He says, "For the creation waits with eager longing for the revealing of the sons of God." That's an interesting thought. Creation itself is waiting for the revealing of the sons of God. He says, "For the creation was subjected to futility, not willingly, but because of him who subjected it, in hope that the creation itself will be set free from its bondage to corruption and obtain the freedom of the glory of the children of God. For we know that the whole creation has been groaning together in the pains of childbirth until now. And not only the creation, but we ourselves, who have the first fruits of the Spirit, groan inwardly as we wait eagerly for adoption as sons, the redemption of our bodies. For in this hope we were saved." This is an amazing idea. Creation longs for that redemption. We long for that redemption. And it will only happen, all of these problems, all of this tarnish will only be set right through the power of Jesus Christ. Now, I know we've talked about a lot of things. We've seen some dark sides of the story. We've seen some positives to the story. There's a lot more we could have talked about, but just for a moment, please allow me to just reiterate very briefly what we saw this morning. We need to understand that, number one, we were created to be wonderful image bearers of God himself. But secondly, we were born into a fallen world, and we've sinned, and we've broken that image. We have become tarnished. Thus, thirdly, a very important point we need to understand is that we deserve destruction. But God, being rich in mercy, being rich in grace, has not only redeemed us in the here and now and justified us and is transforming us, he will redeem all of creation through us. And so the invitation for you, for anyone who has not accepted that precious gift, the invitation is for you. The ball is in your court. Do you want that redemption? Do you want freedom from that corruption and violence that we have fallen into? God offers it to you this morning. Please come. Or whatever your need is, please come as together we stand and as we sing this song.